Thank you for stopping by at the Movie Marquee. Our podcast reviews well-known movies and contains spoilers. The podcast may contain mature subject matter and mature language. Listener discretion is advised. Enjoy the show.
Quiet on set. Places, everybody. And action.
Welcome, everyone, to the Movie Marquee. With me is Ted.
Hi.
And Eric.
Hello.
And those are two meatheads. And, of course, I'm Ken. Well, today we are focusing on Rob Reiner. And we'll be doing 4 movies from Rob Reiner, including The Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, A Few Good Men, and The American President. Now, there are so many great movies that Rob Reiner has done, so everybody's probably asking, why not do Stand By Me, or This is Spinal Tap, or Misery? There's just so many great movies here. We decided to go with these 4, but don't worry, eventually we will hit those movies during another time. So let's go into our questions about Rob Reiner here. So guys, when did you first become aware of Rob Reiner?
The first movie I would have seen of Rob Reiner's would have been Stand By Me, because my dad was a big Stephen King fan, so I would have seen that on video. I would have been way too young to have seen it in the theater, but I did see it on video. So that was my introduction, and then, well, you know what? It probably would have been The Princess Bride, but I was too young to have known directors at that time. So it probably was The Princess Bride, because I did see The Princess Bride in the movie theater. Then it would have been Stand By Me. Then when I was a little bit older is when A Few Good Men, that movie really sparked my interest in him as a director. That movie is so phenomenal. I was a big Tom Cruise fan, and Jack Nicholson. That was a natural hit for me. But then I started to seek out more of his movies after that. And that's when I saw Misery. And then, of course, When Harry Met Sally, I saw when I was in college. And I absolutely adored that movie. And I can't wait to talk about that movie, because that movie has shaped opinions of things in my personal life. And he's an amazing director. Whatever he's directing, it seems like he captures the human element of those characters better than some directors.
Okay. What about you, Eric? When was the first time that you became aware of Rob Reiner?
Well, for me, Rob Reiner initially was Michael Stivic on All in the Family, Meathead. And I was a big All in the Family fan, watching it in reruns. So I knew him from there. I knew the name Rob Reiner, but I was not aware that he was a director until I also saw Princess Bride on good old VHS tapes, along with Stand By Me. That's when I kind of knew who Rob Reiner was. But it wasn't until I actually was able to watch This is Spinal Tap, where I actually saw Rob Reiner and his little USS, whatever the ship is, hat interviewing the band. And I'm like, oh, that's Meathead. And then I started kind of getting a little more into him and seeing some of the great movies he's done, When Harry Met Sally, Misery, Few Good Men, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, he's always going to be Meathead.
It's funny that you brought up Meathead, Eric, because when I was younger, like early teens, and I was finding out about directors and things like that and what people were doing in the movies and stuff, I never put the connection between Meathead on the reruns of All in the Family and the guy directing some of the movies that I like. But he's also a great actor in some movies, too. He's transcended past Meathead. I never put that together. And once that happened, it was like a mind blow moment for me.
He always says, like in interviews and stuff, I'm always going to be Meathead. If I ever win the Nobel Prize, the headline is going to be Meathead wins the Nobel Prize.
But that role was so perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting how he got the role of Meathead. All in the Family was the first time I was aware of Rob Reiner, because I watched it towards the end of its run, plus the reruns, because I'm a little bit older than both of you. I was able to watch that show.
I think it ran 71 to 79.
Yeah. It was very interesting how Archie treated, Meathead. Everything that came out of his mouth was stupidity, is how Archie basically looked at it. But there was a lot of characteristics of Meathead that was Rob Reiner. because Rob Reiner was that activist. He was very against the Vietnam War, and he was very into politics, and some of that was used in the actual TV show. He's the son of the great Carl Reiner. As a little kid, he had a lot of influences around him. Mel Brooks, of course, but Norman Lear was like a second father to him. When you think of TV shows, especially those of the 70s and 80s, Norman Lear wrote all that stuff.
Well, the modern sitcom wouldn't exist in any of its forms if it wasn't for Norman Lear.
Right. Reiner before that he had bit parts. The other day I actually saw him on the 60s classic Batman.
He was a writer for
The Smothers Brothers.
Smothers Brothers, yeah, with
Yes.
Steve Martin. I didn't
Yes.
know that. That's so crazy.
And it's very interesting because later on, Steve Martin then is directed by his father, Carl Reiner, in a number of films.
Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting how that all turns around. Norman Lear had always kind of encouraged Rob, and he was very appreciative. If you listen to any interviews with Rob Reiner, he really holds Norman Lear up really high in his life. So we have Rob Reiner as the writer, as a director, and as an actor. Any preference?
For me, it's director. I mean, I like his acting in All in the Family. Like Ted said, he has some bit parts in some of his movies, some other movies in the 80s and 90s. But for me, his directing is clear above it all.
I have to agree with you on that. His directing is really top notch. I mean, it's part of the reason why we're spotlighting him. But his writing is really good. But what's funny, as an actor, he's so versatile. Like, I know he was really good friends with Carroll O'Connor, who played Archie Bunker. And if you remember in Wolf of Wall Street by Martin Scorsese, he plays Belfort's dad. And essentially, he kind of has that Archie Bunker style to him playing Jordan's dad. He's so gruff and he verbally abuses everybody, and it's so out of character for the person who is Rob Reiner. I can't really say that I don't like anything that he does, but when he directs something, I've got to at least take it in some way.
I tend to agree with you both on this as far as the director part, mainly because the films that he has directed are just iconic. I mean, Meathead is an iconic role in All of the Family. As Ted was talking about the relationship with Carroll O'Connor, they did a lot of ad-libbing with their lines, and you could just see what a wonderful connection they had together. I mean, to play opposites fighting each other on TV does take, like for instance, me and Ted watch a lot of wrestling, and you have to have a partner that knows you really well to have a great match. Same thing here with acting. The other person has to know you and play off of you so well. And these two played off each other so well in All the Family that one of the reasons why the next show, I think it was Archie Bunker's Place.
Yeah, that didn't last very long.
Well, last 4 seasons, but it didn't have the same magic because you didn't have Meathead. You didn't have that character. We also didn't have Edith. They killed her off in the first season. Spoiler alert, by the way, if you were ever going to watch that show. But once he was gone, it took away that chemistry that was so wonderful about that show.
Well, Archie didn't have a protagonist. The character of Archie Bunker needs somebody to be his foil.
Right. You also had the Jeffersons for a brief time frame, and they got their own show. But All in the Family is such a iconic show. It wouldn't be made today.
All in the Family was so revolutionary for the topics they covered. Racism, bigotry, religion, politics. I mean, it was way ahead of its time.
I don't know if you guys seen that I think it was this past year.
Oh, that the remake, the live one?
ABC did those live sketches of some of the most iconic episodes.
Yeah.
It was a who's who of people lining up to play these characters that Norman Lear created. It's a testament to that show. The reason that it couldn't be made today is because it's already been made. And anything that comes now, it would seem like it's going out of its way to imitate it because it was so groundbreaking. Once that ground's been broken, it's like everything else is an imitation. It wouldn't have the same impact as All in the Family did back in the day, or the Jeffersons did, or Good Times did, which are all Norman Lear shows.
The political correctness of the day and age, too, on network television is completely just off the scale. I mean, you probably could do it on cable, but you couldn't make that network anymore. That ship has sailed. And you're right. Anything else would be just compared to it. It'd be a knockoff.
Right. It wouldn't be any good.
All three of us agreed that directing is what we liked most about Rob Reiner. So we talked about Kubrick's directing style in our last spotlight. Does Reiner have any type of particular style that you see?
I don't know if he really has a style. When it comes to Rob Reiner films, I think for me, it's him getting the right cast together, the right people, letting them do their thing, occasional ad lib. And some of the stuff I've read about the movies that he's done is the cast will just start cracking up while they're doing their lines because Rob's on the side behind the camera just laughing, and he's making everyone on set laugh. I mean, he just seems like such a fun guy to be around on set. And I have heard in many of the interviews I've read, I don't think I have heard anything negative about his directing style, his personality, I mean, who he is. Yeah, his politics might be a little on the left there. He is considered a pretty extreme liberal, but as a guy, I think he's pretty okay.
I mean, to compare him as a directing style to like Kubrick, it's a completely different acting style. I think what we take from Rob Reiner's directing style, like what Erik said, I think he has an uncanny ability to be able to find the person who inhabits a role the best. And his casting ability is amazing. He's more character-centric that way. It almost feels like that in that case, he gets so much more out of the actors in that way than some other directors do. There's a humanity to his movies that is hard to find in some other movies. And I know, Ken, you had brought up that we're going to be doing The American President. And you had mentioned to me before in a discussion that it's a lot like Frank Capra. And that's so very true. Whereas the characters that he had brought together, and when those characters are on screen, they feel human. And that's something that you don't get out of a lot of actors. Sometimes their characters that they put on screen, they feel like characters on a screen. Like in When Harry Met Sally, you understand Billy Crystal. You feel that character. You feel like you could inhabit that character. And that's partially the writing too. But that comes from the director being able to find the right actor for that part. And I think in almost all of his movies that we've mentioned, even take Misery. By all accounts, it's technically a horror movie.
It's not a typical Rob Reiner film.
It's not a typical Rob Reiner
really
film,
isn't.
but then in a way it is, because he found Kathy Bates. Kathy Bates wasn't a big star at the time. He found somebody who inhabited Annie Wilkes to the point that it was scary. Now, you can't think of anybody else ever playing that character.
Nope.
That goes for a lot of his characters. Could you imagine anybody else doing Inigo Montoya from The Princess Bride? Or take Billy Crystal's place in When Harry Met Sally? Or then even Tom Cruise or Jack Nicholson from A Few Good Men? I don't know. I couldn't see really anybody else playing those parts anymore. He has a unique capability of getting the performance that makes that character human and come to life.
You brought up Frank Capra. Well, Rob Reiner's favorite movie is It's a Wonderful Life. You can see that in A Few Good Men and American President, maybe even Stand By Me to a certain extent. You could see the Capra type of element there. But you also have, as I stated earlier, look at who he was around as a kid. You had the greatest comedy team of writers ever on the show of shows.
Yeah, the show shows, Sid Caesar's The Show Shows. Yeah, you had his dad, Carl. You had Mel Brooks. You had Woody Allen. I mean,
yeah.
Do you need to go any farther than those three guys? I mean,
Yeah. I mean, you also had Sid Caesar himself, and you had Neil Simon.
Oh.
Right. So, I forgot Neil Simon, yeah.
And that's just skimming the surface. There are so many more influences there. We know more of Carl Reiner now later in our lives through the Oceans series. But on the show of shows, he was like the second man. You had Sid Caesar, and then you had Carl Reiner. And I think he takes the best parts of the people that he has met. We already talked about Norman Lear, but he talks about one of his favorite comedy things of all time is The 2,000-Year-Old Man with Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner. So I see him using these elements in his movies. I mean, we'll be talking about The Princess Bride next, and you could see a lot of his dad and Mel Brooks. We could easily see Mel Brooks as Miracle Max. We could easily see that. In fact, they even thought about using him, but then it would be a Mel Brooks movie. They didn't want it all of a sudden be associated with Mel Brooks. On that note, do we see any similarities between him and his dad as far as acting, directing, writing.
The comedic timing. I think that's one of the things that you see with a lot of Rob Reiner stuff, that you see timing is a big deal.
That can't be taught. That's inherent.
That's natural.
That's
I mean,
natural.
A Few Good Men, of course, is not a funny movie, but it was a Tony-winning play. It got its start on Broadway. And there's timing in that movie that is perfect. The whole end sequence, I can't wait to talk about that when we talk about A Few Good Men, but the timing of that, between that whole scene between Cruise and Nicholson, is perfect. And I think you see that in a lot of Reiner's movies too, and I think he has to have gotten that from his being exposed with his dad and Mel Brooks and then Neil Simon and Woody Allen. I mean, wow. How can you have not learned?
I think that's the thing, is being around all those writers makes him know what good writing is. We look at The Princess Bride. It's one of his favorite books. That's why he made The Princess Bride. You look at Few Good Men and The American President, Aaron Sorkin movies. Me and Eric are big fans of his.
Oh, Aaron Sorkin's awesome.
Let's be honest. The American President is very similar to The West Wing.
Right.
We look at Misery and Stand By Me, Stephen King.
Right.
Yeah.
He knows great work. And what's great about him is he's able to take those great writings and he's able to put that on the screen because he could think like a writer too. Some directors can't think like a writer. Rob Reiner can.
Think about the originality of This Is Spinal Tap. I mean, he wrote that and he directed it. I mean, that is an incredibly written movie, documentary, if you will.
Yeah, and I talked about casting. You look at This Is Spinal Tap, that's the Christopher Guest crew.
Yeah.
That's Harry Shearer, that's Michael McKean, and of course Christopher Guest. And those guys all would go later on to Best in Show, Waiting for Guffman. That's a comedy troupe, essentially. And those guys are beyond brilliant. I think Reiner fits right in there with these guys and can go and direct these guys because his formative years were around that comedy troupe. A lot of modern comedy came from Your Show of Shows. That's just pure and simple. There was a series documentary on CNN called The History of Comedy. And it seems like every episode in some way comes back to Your Show of Shows. You can't have things that came after without that. And I think he learned a lot of that with, he's able to do so much with different casts. The Harry Shearer and Christopher Guest and that crew, they're not easy to direct.
And the funny thing about the people that he directs, there are a number of times that they've come back. You talked about Christopher Guest. Rob Reiner said that if he could, he would put Christopher Guest in every single movie that he's made. In fact, we see him, Christopher Guest, we see him in This Is Spinal Tap, but then we see him in A Few Good Men. He's playing the doctor.
And of course, he's also in Princess Bride too.
And then we see Billy Crystal in a number of roles. So, and he has great relationships with these people. It's not like all of a sudden it's up and done. These people are very fond of Rob Reiner. There seems to be something natural, maybe because he's a writer, he's an actor, he's a director. He's grown up in the showbiz family, so he gets show business. He gets it. How do we compare Rob Reiner to other directors in the past 50 years?
Rob Reiner, probably, if you would have asked me this question in, say, 1993, 1994, I'd say he's probably a top 5 director. The man had the golden touch when it came to movies. And I'm not saying that his later movies are not good movies. They're not great. They're not blockbusters. They're not movies that roll off your tongue. But I think if you want to be considered a top 5, top 10, top 20 director, you need to have movies that people have heard of, people recognize, people know. And I think, unfortunately, in the last 20 years, that kind of has fallen off, and he's kind of hasn't had that Midas golden touch when it's come to the huge blockbusters that he had in the 80s and 90s. I'd probably put him in a top 100 directors of all time.
What's your thoughts, Ted?
It's tough for me because the movies I love. When you're sitting there and you're, let's make your top 20 or your top 25 directors. He's one of those guys that could easily fall out of it until somebody that's in your discussion group sits there and goes, well, what about Rob Reiner? And you're like, oh, yeah. He's not one of those automatic people that you just plug in there. But then when you think about it, it's like, oh, well, yeah. I mean, look at what he's done. I don't fault him for a lot of the stuff that's come later here, but I have to put him up there. And seeing this is hard too because he's a completely different director than somebody like Stanley Kubrick. It's not really fair. The movie styles are completely different. Rob Reiner's not making art. He's making movies.
Yeah, Kubrick was making art in perfection.
He's making art. And Rob Reiner's making fun movies that are for everybody.
Well, we don't have to talk about Kubrick. We also have talked about Kevin Smith and Cameron Crowe before this.
You talk about like Cameron Crowe. I see a lot of similarities between him and Cameron Crowe. I mean, An Amazing Life comparatively to like Cameron Crowe.
Came out hot, fire right out of the gate.
And they've made movies that are going to last the test of time. Stand By Me is always going to be one of the definitive coming-of-age movies of all time. I have no problem making that statement. The Princess Bride will always be a timeless tale, a fairy tale that everybody can find something in. I mean, he has to be up there. I mean, for me, he's definitely my top 25. Where? That's going to be debatable. He's not going to probably crack the top 5 for me. He's one of those guys that the more you talk about him, and the more I've watched the movies here recently, the more he keeps crawling up my list. It's funny that way because, like I said at the beginning of what I was saying, he's one of those guys that if you're sitting there and you're trying to rack your brain coming up, who are my favorite? He could easily fall out of there because you almost take him for granted.
For granted, because he really hasn't had a major hit movie in 25 years.
That's true.
The American President was probably his last glorious movie. I'm looking at the list here. Rumor Has It in 2005. The Bucket List in 2007. LBJ in 16, which was not good. I did not like LBJ.
But Woody Harrelson was nominated for an Academy Award.
I know. I don't think he deserved it, but whatever. That's a whole different podcast right there. The man had the golden touch when it came to those movies that came out. You knew you were getting a great movie. I mean, granted, I have not seen this, but I read the reviews on it. 1994's North, Between a Few Good Men and an American President. The reviews were pretty much, it's the worst movie ever made.
Roger Ebert said that it was one of the worst movies that had ever been made.
I got to see this thing. I got to see it just for that. Have you seen it?
No, I have not.
I have seen it, and it's not as horrible as it sounds. What it is,
it has a great cast, though. Yeah.
But the problem is, though, you're right. He was riding so high. You had Stand By Me, Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, Misery, A Few Good Men, and then you had North.
Right.
I mean, they're all not going to be winners. And I think when you hit a certain age in your life, we talked about this about Cameron Crowe.
And Kevin Smith.
And Kevin Smith. They had a few movies, and then they could never really recapture the magic of what they did when they started. Rob Reiner, you could say, was the golden goose from 85 to about mid-90s. His movies are doing great. I think Ghost in Mississippi is still good in 1996. Alex and Emma is okay. Rumor Has It,
It's
The Bucket
cute.
List, and then the rest of it are really, they're not movies I've even seen because I've barely even heard of any of them.
Rumor Has It tries to do too much. Yeah, I've seen it.
It almost reminds me of a Terms of Endearment remake.
If they'd have let that movie stand on its own and not try to retcon The Graduate into that movie's a lot better. But trying to include The Graduate storyline made that movie kind of muddled.
The disappointing thing for me is, why did he stop writing, though? He doesn't write movies. He helped write This Is Spinal Tap. But after that, he doesn't write any of the movies until 2010's Flip. And he was a good writer. I'm trying to understand why he did not want to invest any time in being a writer and controlling maybe a little bit more.
That's a great question. I don't know
what he did. So we're coming towards the end of our discussion about Rob Reiner. Is there any last fun facts, tidbits about Rob Reiner that you both want to share with us?
No, I mean, there's not a whole lot that I would want to say more about Rob Reiner other than the fact that I love him as a human being. I think he's a genuinely good human being, and that's really hard to find in Hollywood. I loved his dad. I'm sad that when he passed away. And Rob Reiner made some of the movies that shaped my childhood and into my early adult years. I'm always going to have a warm place for Rob Reiner.
Rob Reiner seems like the kind of guy you just want to go out and have beers with and just talk with the guy. He seems genuinely just like a really great guy, not a staunchy Hollywood director. Like his father, I hope he lives to 98 years old.
I do too.
And I think for everyone out there, if you haven't seen a lot of these older Rob Reiner movies, you got to go out and watch them because they are just treasures. And they really are great movies. I know I was giving him a little hard time on some of his older stuff, but you got to go out and you got to watch him. And I think you're really going to appreciate him even more. And I'm looking forward to looking at some of these movies with you guys.
One of the movies that we didn't even talk about at all, his second film, The Sure Thing, is actually a fun little comedy with John Cusack. It might have been actually the first movie I actually saw of Rob Reiner's. It's a fun little movie that doesn't get played much anymore, but that's another movie you guys should check out down the road. And as far as what you said, Eric, about drinking buddy, he does sound like somebody you want to sit down, have dinner with, have cocktails with, and just chew the fat. I don't agree with Rob Reiner as far as politically, but he sounds reasonable. You know, you get some actors, directors that they have a platform and they just sound nuts on both sides of the equation. And
I mean, the one thing you can say about Rob Reiner is his politics have followed him since probably the 1960s. He hasn't changed his views. He's been the person. Oh yeah, beyond consistent. He was rumored to run for governor against Schwarzenegger in California. He's helped overturn and get some propositions in California. He's a very political activist out there. And you got to admire the guy for that. You might not agree with his politics, but he's the kind of guy that's out there who's walking the walk and talking the talk.
He's always remained true to himself.
That's true.
And that's very hard to find in Hollywood land, where being fake is so easy.
He lets you know what his stance is, but he doesn't force his stance on you. So if you have a different stance, he doesn't cut you off. I feel like he respects people. We were talking about Frank Capra. Frank Capra had his political stances. And these are kind of similar guys that they had strong political stances, yet they love people. And that's why I chose Rob Reiner, because I feel like he is genuine and I love his movies. It was kind of funny because, like Ted, you said earlier, when you think of all these directors, you go down the list. We went down the list and stuff together. And Rob Reiner all of a sudden popped up. And I'm like, I got to do Rob Reiner.
Yeah.
Got to do him. Because some of these movies for me are top notch. So I'm very excited about doing this. Well, that's all the time we have to look at Rob Reiner. But stay tuned for us as we're going to be doing The Princess Bride on our next show. And we have just a recent name change. So if you're like wondering, where's the drive-in feature movie review? We're not going to change the name anymore. This is the last name, we promise. We are now called the Movie Marquee.
The Movie Marquee.
So make sure that you put that into your, however you try to remember your podcast, however you do it. Remember, we are now called the Movie Marquee.
Tell your friends.
Tell your friends what's going to be on the marquee next.
That's
the
right.
Princess Bride. With that note, it's time for us to say goodbye. Gentlemen, any last words?
See you at the movies.
Inconceivable.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.